I would say that the single biggest indicator we got is when Secretary Blinken was finally, like 2, 3 months after the balloon incident, finally able to get into China, and he discovered that the foreign minister didn't even have access to Xi. I think that's a bigger risk. Keep in mind that the same purge that has gone on throughout the bureaucracy has not left the military unaffected. For the balloon situation, for example, it wasn't their military, it was some asshat in the intelligence directorate who just thought that this is how we stick it to the Americans. Uh, it's a non-zero risk, and our intelligence services are capable of monitoring those people because they're having conversations. You can't bug Xi's phone because he never talks to anyone. Um, I don't want to say it can't happen, but Xi has purged talent out of the military as well. And so if someone in China did pull the trigger, you would expect to see a relatively similar breakdown in the decision making within the military that we're seeing within the bureaucracy, and it probably wouldn't go as well as a lot of people think it would. Keep in mind that aside from providing intelligence and equipment, the Biden administration has not moved us closer to being in any sort of meaningful conflict with anyone. This is probably what we're seeing under Trump and under Biden, the building of the new template, where the U.S. regularly puts its finger on the scales, but doesn't actually put boots on the ground. So the risk is to be borne by foreign partners. The fighting is to be done by foreign partners. So we're not going to have troops in Ukraine. We're not going to have troops in Gaza, but we are perfectly willing to step in with military assistance and intelligence in order to help certain players that we want to do better. That is probably what we're going to be doing for the next 20 years, regardless of who wins the next presidency. As for decision making within the United States, Congress is kind of a mess right now, and that's going to last for a while. We're going through our once every generation or two political reshufflings when the factions that make up the parties move around. And at times like that, you get these little cliques, like the Jim Jordan clique or the Matt Gaetz clique, who rise to prominence because the party is no longer capable of policing its own. We're seeing the same thing on the Democratic side. It's just because they're in the minority, it's not as loud. That will last until such time as the factions settle into a new format. And I think that's still going to take at least another 3 or 4 years. I don't think it's going to happen before this presidential cycle is finished. If you look at this as objectively as you can, the very short version is that the Trump administration, by elevating the populists, pushed the business community and the national security community out of the Republican coalition. So they've effectively become swing voters. And with all this churn now, Congress is going to have a very difficult time doing anything until such time as the party structure settles into a format that is more appropriate for the environment that we're in. If I were a betting man, I would guess that this is the moment that a third party of disaffected Republicans forms and then sucks in a lot of moderate Democrats to become the balance of power within Congress. We're not there yet. A lot of these disaffected Republicans haven't quite come to the conclusion that they are no longer functionally party members, but I think we're going to get there in the next 2 years. Sure, the presidency, I agree. I don't think that can happen. But this is the 7th time we've gone through one of these transitions. And in the first 3, we definitely got a third party that formed, and then one of those 3 parties died. In the more recent 3, what's happened is there was an evolution within the coalitions and the factions switched side. What we're going through right now is a lot more similar to the first 3, because right now the core, the decision makers, the old school Republicans have been ejected from their own institution. And these are people who have the money, who have the skill set, who know how to work together, and above all, have never not been part of a political coalition. So they're kind of having this allergic response to being out of power completely. That's going to trigger them to do something that, from our point of view today, might be a little unprecedented. But if you look back historically, we've done this 3 times before. Well, that is certainly Mohammed bin Salman's plan. If the Saudis decide to ignore the Palestinians and just cut the deal with the Israelis, they're perfectly capable of managing their own street. And then you have this bilateral alliance within the region that takes the most technological power and merges it with the largest regional economy and the world's largest oil producer. That's a powerful partnership. And if the Saudis do manage to move on from the Palestinians, the Emiratis already have, the Moroccans already have, the Egyptians already have, and that would probably trigger the Omanis and the Kuwaitis and all the others to join as well. So if this sticks, you're talking about the Israelis and the Arab world more or less strategically being on the same side. And at that point, it doesn't really matter what the Americans do. In fact, that would allow the Americans just to step back and allow the region to take care of Iran. From our point of view, that might be the least bad outcome. Well, again, it's the Saudis. I mean, Palestine and to a lesser degree Israel, not an oil producer or an oil consumer or an oil transit point. So back in 1973 with the Yom Kippur War, that is where the Saudis, under the older generation, took a strong stance for the Palestinians and against the West when it came to energy policy. That created OPEC, that created all the pain that is still kind of lingering in the back of our lizard brain. But that hasn't been relevant for 30 years. So what we saw during the late 1990s and the very early 2000s is every time something would cook off in the Palestinian territories, oil prices would go up just out of emotion. But once we had the 9/11 assault and the Iraq War and the coup in Venezuela, or the coup attempt in Venezuela, the oil markets kind of wisened up and like, okay, there are a lot bigger things going on here that have a very real impact on this market than stone throwers in the West Bank. And so over the next 20 years, the Palestinians just vanished from the scene as a factor in energy. And what we're seeing today is an underlining that that is still the case. So if there is going to be an oil shock, it will not have anything to do with Palestine or Israel. It will be about the Saudi response to what's going on in Palestine and Israel. And at the moment, we're still waiting for that intergenerational argument to be shaken out. If the king wins, well, it was the king's generation that played a role in the formation of OPEC. And it will not be quiet if it goes that direction. There is a large faction of the population in Israel that are basically wards of the state. They're ultra Orthodox. They study the Torah. They have low taxes and high subsidies, and so a very high population growth, lots of kids. And they now have been sufficiently strong at the polls to generate a significant amount of the factions that are part of the Netanyahu government. And to be perfectly blunt, most of them are wastes of skin. They've never had a real job. They've never been in business. Their education is purely religious. It's not based on politics or geography or economics or anything. And they're ministers. And they have been on watch while this attack manifested. And the credibility hit to them with the overall population in Israel is crippling. So I don't know how long this government can last, but I know that this specific government will fall because they have proven they're incapable of running the country without a lot more practice at doing something else. Now, whether Bibi falls or comes back in the next election, who knows? That dude is a political survivor. Do not write him off. But this specific coalition government, yeah, it is not long for this world. Yeah, well, I would say if you're Mohammed bin Salman, this is great because it's showing the writing on the wall and what the Americans want. And so, you can either align yourself with that or align yourself against that. The older generation, this is going to be more complicated because if there's one thing that everyone in Saudi Arabia recognizes is that they're fat and they're lazy and they're incapable of defending themselves. They have to have a security guarantor. And if they side against Israel in this fight publicly and loudly, well, that'll never be the United States or Israel then. And all of a sudden, then they've got to find someone else, anyone else. And all of the other options